What's going on again, everybody? Brandon here, hanging out in the gallery and studio today, and I've got a video today that is it's a part of a video that I did for one of my recent dog commissions. I've been turning out a lot of dogs here lately. I think my last 5 or 6 paintings have all been dog pet portrait commissions, and there's only so many dog portrait painting videos I can put out. So what I'm doing on this one is showing you a little bit of my process of how I do the background trees behind this particular dog. So it's similar to the background trees that you see on this painting here that I did of the monarch butterfly migration. So there's another video tutorial up of this one, a walkthrough of this process. But if you'll notice the trees in the background there, it's a little bit of a distant tree line. It's not quite in focus kind of deal. So there's not a lot of detail back there because it's supposed to be further away from the viewer. And so to see my process of creating those tree lines in the background, we're going to check that out in this video now. We are going to put in a distant tree line behind this dog, just kind of a faded out of focus looking distant tree line behind this dog, and then get started on the dog itself. So we're going to get started with the background first. I'm going to be using some acrylics on this, a 1-inch brush for the most part to do the, well, maybe a 2-inch and a 1-inch brush to do this background with, and just fade in some different values of green and some brown back there to make it look like a distant tree line. Alright, so as I'm starting this distant tree line here, I'm using basically a 1-inch flat brush here to do this, and in the lower areas of this I'm keeping darker because when you're talking about a tree line, normally in the canopy at the top is where the light comes in, so it's going to be lighter up at the top, but down here underneath is where it's usually shady and darker. So for now, on this bottom area, this is really just a lot of browns and dark greens and blacks mixed in because this is going to be a shady area underneath. And then as I move up towards the top, I will start to lighten things up. And really all I'm doing here is working around my sketch of my dog that I'm going to be painting in here. So depending on what your painting is, I mean, you could be covering the entire canvas doing this, or if you're working around another image that's going to be painted ultimately, you could do it the same way. So I'm going to be working around my sketched in image of my dog here as I'm doing in this blocking in essentially of my background trees. But you'll notice here as I'm getting higher up that the values are getting lighter. You're starting to see a little bit more of the green color come through. You also see that I tend to rotate and turn my brush a good bit as I'm doing this, especially towards the top, creating that tree, leaf, and limb texture. So towards the bottom here it's more even strokes, but as I come up towards the top here and start getting this lighter green, you're going to see that I start to rotate and turn my brush as I basically dab that color in. And all that's really doing for me again is just giving me the illusion of lots of shadows and edges of things going on in the background, whether it's going to be leaves or limbs or some kind of texture, something like that in the distance. So that's how I do my initial blocking in here of this background color. And then I'm going to ultimately come back over this and obviously put in what highlights I'm going to put in. But the point of this is you don't do a lot of detail work because you are trying to make it look like a distant tree line that's a little bit further away from the viewer than whatever your main subject is. So you're not going to be putting a lot of detail in this because a viewer would not actually see all the detail if it's further away from them. And if you want to create that contrast and that illusion on the painting, you have to make sure not to go too carried away with your detailed work on this background tree line. So as I finish this up, that's all I'm doing is just trying to block in the colors. Okay, now I have a blocked in layer of my distant tree line in the background here, and so I'm going to come back in now with a smaller brush, about a 1-inch brush now, and I'm going to finish doing what detailing I am going to do to that tree line. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit in some areas because I want the dog to be able to contrast well with the background. So I'm going to lay in a few tree trunks here and there, and then bring in some lighter values of the green to make it look like some leaves back there in the distance. So we're going to get started with that now. First thing I'm doing here at the bottom is just adding in a couple of lighter leaf highlights down into this shaded area just to give it a little bit of extra something at the bottom. And now as I'm going to start putting in a few indications of tree trunks here. Again, we're not looking for high detail on this. We're just giving the idea that there are definitely some tree trunks and some limbs back there in the distance. So I'm still using my 1-inch brush, and I'm just laying in, you know, with the indications of some tree trunks back there with some darker brown and some black coloration. A few random tree trunks, or excuse me, tree limbs here now with a smaller angled brush as I'm laying in some limbs, and some of these tree trunks are a little smaller diameter. I had to switch to this smaller brush here, but this is just, you know, randomly putting a few things in a dark enough color tone to contrast against that lighter green that I have laid in the background. And you can put in as many or as few of these as you want. So I just dropped a few in until I was happy. And now the process becomes layering in different values of light and dark to highlight a few things. So just to add a little bit to the tree trunks there, I put in a little bit of lighter brown highlight. Now I'm back to a flat brush that I'm doing leaf texture with. And this is a process of a couple of different layers, again, of just different values of this green. So putting in some lighter values of green, putting in some darker values, and just going back and forth to create multiple layers and levels of that green coloration. And then again, up towards the top of this canopy is where I'm bringing in the brightest colors, because that's where the most light would be coming in. And I'm also, in this particular painting, I'm going to be painting a black fur dog. So I wanted the black fur of this dog to contrast well with the background. So I wanted to make sure I brought in enough of the lighter colors of green leaves around it, that way that the dog would contrast with it very well and stand out when I was, you know, adding the final image to the canvas here. But again, you're not worried about detail on this distant tree line. You're just giving the indication, the illusion that there is leaves or limbs or stuff going on. So I'm rotating and turning this flat brush again to create different edges, different textures, different shapes of the leaf indications going on in the background. So I'm just rotating it as I go and switching up my values of green and darker green. That's all this really is creating that process of back and forth to create the depth of the trees in the background, but still not enough detail that make them look like they're very close to the viewer. And again, on the painting that you saw at the beginning of this video, it's the same process to create the fall foliage. Obviously I was just using the different colors of reds and oranges and yellows and browns to create the fall foliage look in the background. This is more of a summertime looking scene. This dog is going to be outside, you know, in the summer months, so we're going with all greens here for the background of this particular dog. A source image that I had for this dog was in a yard that had the background trees were very much greened out like this, so I was just going to keep it consistent with the photo that the customer provided me. Now my last touch here is entering in a little bit of the sky through the leaves itself. This is just a little mixture of a bluish gray color for a sky that would be peeking through some of these leaves to break up a little bit of that leaf canopy towards the top. That's all I'm really doing now, is just adding that in. It's basically the last step that I make. Once I kind of get happy with the amount of sky that I've got showing through here, I'll add maybe one last finishing touch on some of the greenery, just to kind of fill it back in a little bit, get rid of those hard edges that I created, because again, you don't want a lot of hard edges when you're trying to create something that looks a little out of focus. I'm just trying to soften things up a little bit. Adding a few more highlights to the bottom here, and then that's about it. Alright, I am at a point now where the faded out of the focus anyway, distant tree line there is pretty much finished. And now, so if you want to see how this thing finished out, here is a quick breeze through of some of the time lapse of the dog itself that I painted in top or on top of this faded background tree line, just to give you an idea of what the finished product would look like when you do that distant tree line. Of course, whatever your main subject here is in the foreground will have more detail to it, plus it'll have darker darks and lighter lights, so to speak, so it will appear much closer to the viewer. And there is the finished product of a painting of Bertha, the dog here, sitting in front of that distant tree line. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Until next time, happy painting.